Coming up on the road to now.
The best definition of news is the thing nobody else wants you to know about. And that's the best kind of news as far as I'm concerned. There's lots of other kinds of news. And my favorite, though, is to go find out what happened. A lot of the local corruption, the local shenanigans, the statewide office holders. We've seen a decline in the number of state house reporters, and that's how I came up. I covered 3 different state houses, and the decisions that those lawmakers are making every day really impact people, sometimes to a much larger extent than even Congress or the presidency. But all of those local office holders aren't being held to account because the economics aren't there anymore. And it's a great question, what happens? Each election cycle, we see how social media and technology start to change how elections work, how people get their information. And this is just another example. I don't think it makes the media irrelevant at all. In fact, it makes our jobs even more important because these candidates had the ability to say whatever they want by completely bypassing the media. So then it becomes our job to, fact check that. Is that true? Is that accurate? Is it a little bit misleading? Well, that's our job.
I'm Bob Crawford.
And I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. And we just wrapped up a great interview with a guy named Chris Frates, an investigative reporter, works for CNN, and a great story with a guy whose life has seen the changes in media and has been part from newspaper to today to social media and satellite radio. And Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Chris and what we talked about?
Chris is an investigative reporter for CNN. He also hosts Politics Inside Out on Sirius XM. We talked about, what do we want to talk about on the show, and we came up with the history of news. And what was interesting about Chris is his career parallels. He started out in print journalism at the Denver Post, and then he went to an upstart at the time, Politico. And then he went to the National Journal, and finally he's at CNN. So he's seen a lot of changes, and he's firsthand seen these changes. So it's really interesting. The interview is great because he kind of walks us through this turbulent period in media news history. Also, he's got a great personal backstory. Great guy. Right. A lot of insight. Just a lot of insight to what happens when there is breaking news. What's breaking news? What's not breaking news? How does an investigative report work? What goes on behind the scenes of an investigative report? He's done it all, and we're happy to have him on the show.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found interesting in speaking with him is we think about this huge rupture between traditional print media and social media and these new forms that are coming out. But as we spoke, as Chris told us, actually, there is a rupture in terms of delivery, but the core principles that makes an investigative journalist good at what they do, those core principles are still there. So sometimes we see a huge rupture, but there are some things that stay the same in terms of what makes a good story.
That's right. Who, what, where, when, why, and how will never change.
Some things. Well, we hope you enjoy this episode, and take care.
Chris Frates, welcome to The Road to Now.
Hey, guys, good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
We're happy to have you. Can you just take a minute and introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. So I am a investigative correspondent over at CNN. I work out of Washington, D.C. I do a lot of politics and a lot of investigative work. I also am the co-host of Politics Inside Out. It's a program I do with my buddy Mark Preston on Sirius XM, the POTUS channel 124, which, Bob, I know you're a fan, a POTUS listener. And so, I hope folks will tune in to our show because we try to do it a little bit like you, kind of bring the conversation outside of the Beltway and kind of talk with people who are in the politics game. And it's a lot of fun. So thanks for having me on. I'm really pumped to be a guest.
It's great to be here, and I should note that Bob is not only a listener of your show on Sirius XM, he was also once invited to be on the show. He
was, and he was a great guest. In fact, you got the best reception from my mom, Bob. So, she was like, that was an amazing interview. Like, wow. Like that was like, we've had like, kind of big wheels in Washington on and stuff. And like, but she was like, Bob Crawford, wow, that was just a great interview. So we're going to have you back, dude, because Mom loves you.
Moms love Bob Crawford.
Our listeners, yeah, I do well with the mom demographic. Happy to say. As our listeners probably don't know that Chris and I grew up together in South Jersey, but we didn't know each other. But we're both from the same region, so we're Jersey strong, and more specifically, we're South Jersey strong.
Oh, that's right, and that's an important kind of distinction because within Jersey, the South and the North often fight for supremacy. Obviously, it's called the Garden State because of South Jersey and all the delicious corn and tomatoes and everything we grow down there. It tastes better than anywhere else on the planet. And so, if you're a Jersey hater, just keep it to yourself. You know what I mean? Like, get off the turnpike and come explore New Jersey. That's what I'd say.
It's like Bob is going for the mom points. My mom grew up in South Jersey. It's like he's going for them right now, you guys.
Dude, see, that's the thing. The Jersey Mafia is strong, man. Like, it's like you can't, it's like Kevin Bacon. There's even less than 6 degrees separation when it comes to New Jersey roots, my man.
True.
Well, we wanted to get Chris on to talk about the news, but talk not like really what's in the news so much as how the news business works, how it's changing, and his experiences, working as an investigative reporter, and working on the breaking news end of things sometimes. So, Chris, something that's really interesting about you is you began your career in print. You worked for the Denver Post, just like our old friend Dick Crick, who also worked at the Denver Post.
Oh, right, sure,
yeah,
absolutely.
And then you went to Politico. So, I mean, you went to, some people say the newspapers are dying out. They've definitely downsized. Your average daily newspaper is a lot thinner than it used to be. And then Politico has, I think it has a print footprint. Does it also publish a magazine or a newspaper?
Yep. Yeah. So it has both a print footprint and a magazine, but it's largely known nationwide as a digital operation. So,
what are the differences in working both of those mediums?
Yeah. So it's funny you should mention that because as I came up in newspapers, I got started in high school back in 1997 working for the Gloucester County Times. Circulation 30,000, Gloucester County, New Jersey. Strong shout out there. And I was just an unpaid intern, but by the end of the summer, I was writing articles, and then I went on the next summer, I guess that was summer after my senior year, to work at the Today's Sunbeam, an even smaller newspaper, like 15,000 down in Cumberland County. And, the thing that always struck me about my journalism career is I was always on, like, the tail end of the golden age, right? Like when I got into newspapers, they were still doing like pretty well. And, there was some change, but, everybody told me about, all the old timers were like, what a fun gig it was, how they had these resources to go cover stories all over the place and how it's, it's just the best. And as I kind of graduated from school in 2002, I had done about a dozen internships and had already started to see the decline of the American newspaper. And by the time I got to the Denver Post, I was in my early 20s and I was already getting buyout offers. And I was like, but I don't cost any money. Like, I don't use any health care. I'm a healthy young guy. You don't pay me that much. Like, why would you want to buy me out of all people? And so, that was kind of a warning sign for me. And it's funny because when I decided to jump to Politico, I was one of the first hires for Politico way back in, I guess I started in 2008. I started talking to those guys at the end of 2007 when they were getting ready to launch, and I came on very early. And before I left, people at the Denver Post, it was a strong, newspaper job. It was a good regional newspaper, biggest newspaper of the Rocky Mountain Empire, as they like to call it. And they said, man, like you're leaving a union job, where you get a pay raise every year for this digital thing. Like that seems kind of crazy. And I was like, are you guys like working in the same place I am? Because it seems also just as dangerous to stay here. And my thought was, let's go try the future. Go with a startup. If it doesn't work out, I'm a young guy, I get another job. It'll be fine. And I'm really glad I did, because there was, a startup mentality at Politico. It was just about 30 of us, and it felt a lot like working on a college paper again. I was, a reporter and editor at the University of Maryland college newspaper, the Diamondback. It was a 5-day-a-week paper. It was a daily newspaper. It had a circulation as big as like the first newspaper I worked on in Jersey. And it was that kind of spirit, that kind of startup spirit of a bunch of us, people were rooting against us, saying that Washington didn't need another insider, political news organization. And it was just a ball. I mean, the way you could write, the way that they didn't want kind of that voice of God newspaper convention. You read the New York Times, it's an important newspaper. It's one of the most important newspapers in the world. But they have that kind of style to them that this has happened and we carved it in stone on the mountain, and, you are now receiving this information. Whereas Politico was much more like, us guys talking here. And I remember how that came across in my first story. Was a congressman from Georgia, a guy named Bob Barr, who, when he was in Congress, blocked the District of Columbia from putting medical marijuana into the District of Columbia. Essentially, the way he was able to do it was he stopped the funds that the district needed to count the vote. So the vote never got counted. You'll remember that Congress has some control over the city government here in the District of Columbia because it's a federal district. And so he didn't want to see that go forward, so he blocked it by making sure that they didn't have the money to count the votes. But when he retired, he became a lobbyist. And not just any lobbyist, he became a lobbyist for the Marijuana Policy Project, which, as you guys know, it's a pro-marijuana legalization group. And so when I talked to him, he talked a lot about state rights and all this kind of stuff. But the point of this, when I wrote the story, I said something like, well, just because he's lobbying for the Marijuana Policy Project doesn't mean that Barr has become a bong-ripping hippie. And, that's not a phrase you could get in any newspaper at the time, but I was able to get it into my first story at Politico, and that kind of defined for me the kind of voice, the kind of fun they wanted to have. And they've gone on from, the 30 or so of us who started it. I mean, they have, I think, more than 300 employees now in states across the country, and they even have a whole contingent in Brussels where they're covering the European government there in the same way that they've covered Washington. So it's been a hugely successful venture, and one that I was real proud to be part of in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You graduated in 2002, which is the same year I graduated from college. And I remember a lot of discussion about the way that that news was changing. And I was interested, you got an education. I don't know, sometimes, as a college educator, I will be willing to say that sometimes people write lectures when they begin teaching. And they tend to give those lectures for the rest of their lives. I actually once had a popular culture. It was a media and popular culture class that has actually the semester that 9/11 happened. And I was like, oh, wow, this guy's going to give us a really interesting breakdown of the way that, the media works and everything. And he didn't. He actually kind of wrapped up in the 1970s. And he was like, and who knows what's going to happen with this new Nixon presidency, And I don't know. And it was really like that. I mean, clearly the guy wrote them a long time ago. Did you, when you were going through your education, you kind of came out and you were taught by people who had learned and been teaching under the old method of newspaper and the way it worked, print newspaper. How do you feel like your education prepared you for the changes that were happening? And what were the challenges that came of being someone of our generation where everything changed, while we were a bit older?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question, Ben. And it's, one where I often say I feel like, when the generation that taught me came up, there was a very clear path, in journalism. You would start out at a smaller paper, maybe a weekly, work your way up to a daily paper, and then, hopefully go to a big regional metropolitan daily newspaper, then hope to get to one of the bigs, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. And that was like a clear career path. And then, the whole landscape blew up. And that was a lot of creative destruction, I think. I think there's been a lot of hand-wringing about how, it used to be, and it used to be better when we had, 3 networks and a few big papers that were dictating the agenda every day. But, frankly, if you're a creative entrepreneurial person, this is a great time to be in media. And the skills that I learned, I went to the University of Maryland College of Journalism, the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. And, I learned from a lot of old school reporters. I mean, I had a mix of some of the greatest. I took a class with David Broder, who was the dean of the Washington Press Corps, the most respected reporter and columnist for the Washington Post. I took a class with Pulitzer Prize winner Haynes Johnson, who covered the civil rights movement and wrote lots of books about Washington, also a Pulitzer Prize winner, and also a lot of working journalists. So we had in our classrooms, journalists from the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, because Washington is so central, there's a lot of media organizations here. So those guys were working journalists. They would come in and teach. And I think that helped a lot too, Ben, to have people who were in newsrooms at the time teaching you. But the takeaway that I had, because the technology and the platforms, I don't think anybody could have foresaw that, when I went to work, when I graduated, Politico was still 5 years from launching, right? Like nobody even knew it would exist. So there was no way to prepare for it. But what you could prepare for was how to write, how to report, how to ask questions, how to think analytically. And that really is the bedrock of any journalism that you're going to do on any platform. So if you're going to be a print or a digital reporter, if you're going to be a broadcaster, if you're going to be on the radio, TV, whatever, like you have to know how to write and you have to know how to report and think. And that was kind of the bedrock that you learned in that college, and then in all the internships that I did. I did, like I said, about a dozen of them. The Boston Globe, the Tampa Tribune, the Dallas Morning News, to name a few of them, a couple of state houses. So I was able to work as a student full-time, during the summers and even during some semesters where I was constantly honing the craft and learning from these great editors in real newsrooms. So even though the platform started to change, I had that bedrock. Now, things I wished I had taken, right? Like, I wish I had taken some TV. I didn't take any TV classes, right? So when it became part of the time to talk about your work, particularly when I went to Politico was really smart about putting their reporters and editors on television to talk about the scoops and big stories they had to help drive publicity and promotion and get people knowing that Politico was out there and getting them to know that they were a scoop factory that they needed to check multiple times a day. And that was really a new skill for me, to sit in front of a camera and talk about my stories. Now I got lots and lots of practice, so I got on-the-job training, but I had no broadcast background when I came out of Maryland, and that's since changed. I mean, that curriculum, is not nearly as siloed as it used to be between, print, broadcast, magazine. There used to be these different tracks you would get on. Now you kind of have to know how to play in all of them because digital has really pulled them all together.
So what were some of the skills you had to develop to be on television?
Oh man, I mean, a number of them. The jump to television is a much different jump. It's a different kind of writing. Writing a script is a lot different than writing a print story. It has to be much more conversational. It has to be much clearer. You can't, kind of bog people down into the details. Another one is tracking, and that's when you take your script, you go into a windowless room by yourself with a microphone, and you read that script as if you were telling it to somebody, even though nobody's there, and you end up sounding when you first start like you're reading. And that was a really tough, transition to make, to sound natural, to sound conversational. When you're reading something, you can't ad-lib it. You have to, read the facts. They're vetted. They're, all the same standards apply to a print story, except that you need to perform that story. You need to, kind of read the, you need to read that script in a way that's compelling to people and Sometimes, you need to just be live without a script, and you need to say, here's what's going on, and, present that in a clear, concise, compelling way, and very quickly, frankly. Live shots aren't usually more than, 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So all of the performance of the news, I knew how to gather it, I knew how to get it, but then to perform it in a compelling way where, viewers are going to watch and check it out, that was new to me. Now, what wasn't new to me was to be able to take all that and then write a story and put it on CNN.com because, while lots of people, still watch television, we get an enormous amount of traffic at CNN.com. It's about 72 million uniques a month, more than 1 billion page views. So lots and lots of people coming to read what you write. And that's always been a strong point for me. I can kind of write you a quick, digital story or a long form story, frankly. Either way, you get a lot of shares and a lot of people coming to that content online. And then you can put your television piece on top of that so that there's video to watch. So at its best, it all works together. You have the television piece of it. You hopefully sometimes we even have a digital only video to go with it. And then you bring that kind of old school story telling to the written word to that digital platform.
It's interesting how the technology changes the way you have to perform it. It makes me think about when movies stopped being silent movies and all the old actors who had been in the silent films had to learn how to perform in talkies. It's a very different method.
Very different method, yeah, but a very good metaphor there for sure.
You mentioned performing on television. Performing the news on television. I've seen you do breaking news. I've seen you deliver, like when Hillary Clinton had her meetings with the FBI recently. It was you who broke the news on CNN. What is behind the scenes when there's breaking news? I mean, because a lot of times these days we see that banner, and I think CNN is kind of guilty of this, saying breaking news when Donald Trump pseudo apologized. I'm not sure that that's actually, maybe that is breaking news, but I think there's real breaking news and then there's subjective breaking news. Kind of take us behind the scenes on that.
Sure. So, and this is a criticism that is pretty widely held. And when do you call something breaking news? When does it stop breaking? When does it just become developing? And those are all judgment calls. But in the case that you were talking about when Hillary Clinton was being interviewed at the FBI headquarters at the Hoover Building in downtown Washington about her email server, that is obviously breaking news. You have the presumptive Democratic nominee. She hadn't yet got accepted the nomination at the conventions. We were only a few weeks from the conventions. She's sitting down to be questioned by the FBI about her handling of highly classified information on her private email server. So that's kind of a no-brainer. That's a clear case of breaking news. And when that happens, I mean, you are on television, and I think when you're watching it, you may think that there is kind of more happening than behind the scenes than there is. Frankly, a lot of the time, I was reading things that were coming into my phone from my sources on the air. I was getting them and giving them to the audience almost in real time. And so that is a very different skill than having the ability to step back, gather all the information, and put together a written story. You're giving the developments as they happen. And, it's exciting. It can be a little intimidating when you first start because it's you, the camera, and, the breaking news. And you have folks in your ear talking to you about, wrap it up. We want to move to another question, or we want to move to a guest. And so, that is part of the fun, though, to be on television telling everyone first, hey, look what's happening. Here's what we have. Here's what we have to tell you. That's really, really fun. Now, when you talk about, all right, well, is it breaking news? Is it not breaking news? Remember, I mean, the joke is CNN always has a hit show. We just never know when it's on, right? Because anytime there's breaking news, you get a huge audience, particularly if it's big national, international breaking news. And so that is our bread and butter. And so when there are things that maybe don't rise to the level of a Paris attack, but are breaking news inside of the political world, like, kind of Donald Trump saying, responding to something, or Hillary Clinton responding to something, those are pieces of breaking news. And we want to tell you that this is coming in now. If you're turning on the television, we want you to feel the immediacy that we're learning information. And that is part of the reason why that banner's there, breaking news happening now, because this is just happening. We want to tell you about it. So, hang with us here. We're going to tell you something you didn't know. And that's kind of the point of breaking news, which is you didn't know it, and we're telling it to you now.
I remember being a child, and, there were three networks, really, NBC, ABC, and CBS, and you'd be watching TV at night with your parents, watching the Waltons or something, and that CBS breaking news banner would come on the screen, that just like solid screen of CBS breaking news, and your heart would drop. Like for a second,
Yep.
Like your heart would go into your stomach because you're like, what are they about to say? I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
And it usually wasn't good.
No,
Whatever's
no, it
going to happen, it is bad news. And that's also kind of the difference as well between broadcast and cable news, right? Because broadcast was loath to cut into their entertainment programming. Their entertainment programming was the moneymaker of the network. The news centers were always big cost centers. They didn't make a lot of money for the network. In fact, they cost the networks a lot of money, but they were kind of part of that agreement that they made with the federal government when they got the airwaves, the public airwaves to use. They had to inform the public. So that's where these news centers came out of. And when there were only three networks, those guys were making money hand over fist. They could afford pretty luxurious news operations. I mean, all those networks had foreign correspondents stationed all across the world. They covered, all different kinds of news and events because that was the only news. But when cable started to, take hold, and, CNN was the first cable network launched back in 1980, but I think it really came into the public's consciousness 10 years later during 1990 when you had the Gulf War, right? Because remember, we were watching that live. CNN was the only channel that was broadcasting live inside of Baghdad. And that was a game changer. Nobody had seen anything like that before. In fact, I work with one of the guys, he's still in the Washington, D.C. Bureau, who was able to rig the camera and all of the technical equipment to get a signal out of Baghdad while the bombing was happening. And that really brought the immediacy. We remember, I think, during the 70s when the Vietnam War came into everyone's living room. But remember, those were tapes that were sent, across the ocean. They were days old by the time they got there. And it was a sense that, you could, there was editing, there was, should we air this, should we not air this? What you were watching on CNN was happening live in front of you, and you didn't know what was going to happen. So that was pretty wild. And that was kind of the changing of the guard, which is now you can find out what's going on at any minute. And that sense of immediacy and what are they going to tell me next is what keeps you watching.
Ben, your question?
Yeah, I have a general question about one, kind of linking yourself to the greater history of investigative journalism, because you have this great report a while back on meat in California, right? And the corruption within the FDA that seems to have led this meat producer to be able to sell this cancerous beef to people, without people knowing. And when I was watching that report recently, it made me think about this long history and the muckrakers, in the progressive era. And in particular, and this is perfect, I was just teaching this in my class this week, actually, about the power of investigative journalism and how you actually only know what's going on because someone goes out there and finds it for you. I think sometimes we take that for granted and we forget about that. How do you see yourself within that greater history? Did you learn about these folks when you were growing up? Did they inspire you? How do you see yourself within the greater history?
Yeah, so I mean, I read, staying on the theme, right? Like I read The Jungle when I was a kid, Upton Sinclair's, book about the terrible conditions of all the slaughterhouses and factory farms in the early 19th century, where they were they were just putting whatever kind of meat into sausages and selling it to people. And there's that great story about Teddy Roosevelt, reading The Jungle while he was eating a sausage, and like he throws the blade across the room when he realizes, oh man, like that's terrible. And so, I guess I don't actively think about it when I go to work every day, but certainly it's a cool tradition to be part of. And I think, when people want to beat up on the media, and there's a lot, to criticize, of course, everybody is a critic now, particularly with social media. It's also important to remember that it takes a lot of resources, to pay somebody, that so that they can make a living, to go try to find out what's going on. Because, the best definition of news is the thing nobody else wants you to know about. And that's the best kind of news as far as I'm concerned. There's lots of other kinds of news. And my favorite, though, is to go find out what happened. And in that particular case, when you take a look at this slaughterhouse in California, I saw that they had released 9 million pounds of bad beef, and it was being recalled. And I just thought, like, 9 million pounds, man, that's like a lot of beef. Like, that doesn't seem like an accident, right? Like, how does 9 million pounds of bad beef get into our nation's food supply in, I guess this was in 2014, right? Like, how can that possibly happen? So I started just trying to find out. And what I learned by, reporting from Washington, from going out to California and talking to people, was that slaughterhouse, the foreman and the USDA inspector, who was supposed to be overseeing all of the operations to make sure that everything was safe and edible, that foreman of the slaughterhouse and the USDA inspector were having an affair, which is against all the rules. You're not allowed to do that if you're a USDA employee, a federal government employee. And that when that inspector would leave, they were passing these cold dairy cows, basically. And so when you're a dairy cow, you get to a certain age, you don't produce that much milk. And so they'll often sell you they'll sell those cows to slaughterhouses to make fast food ground beef, essentially. But a lot of those older cows get cancer. And so they were passing these cows through by chopping off their heads. They get cancer of the eye, oftentimes. They're chopping off the heads of these animals and then matching them with healthy cow heads to move that whole body through the process. They were branding it USDA. They had a fake brand, essentially, where they were branding this as past when it was cancerous. And that had all kinds of consequences. But, to go in there, find that out, I went and talked to a congressman from that area. And, he said that they weren't getting answers from the USDA about what happened. They weren't getting answers from federal investigators in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And he went to the floor of the House and said, we need to give the independent inspector general more money to figure out what happened here, $1 million more, in fact. And the quote, I think, was something along the lines of like, CNN knows more about what's going on in this plant than our own government does. And I feel like that's kind of the best and most rewarding work, when you can go in there and find out what's going on, tell people about it, and then get change. Here you had people who had power, trying to move things along on the floor of the House of Representatives because they saw the problem you uncovered. And that's really satisfying.
Yeah, I think that speaks to, once again, to the power of investigative journalism. And, on a more, I guess, less historical account, I think I live in Nashville, and our local paper, The Tennessean, has done really an excellent job of covering local news. But what you see is that the smaller papers in the smaller markets are losing out now because of the shift from from more traditional news sources to these bigger news sources, right? I mean, if people don't support their local newspapers, things like, we had a recent scandal within our child services here, And I think that how do you take that, right? Because there's winners and losers in all of this change, and it seems like the small papers are losing out. And what will replace that? What do you think will come in and replace that? Do you think the market as it exists now is simply not doesn't have a means to supply the type of resources small communities once had?
Yeah, and this is a great question, and it's one that is vexing all of journalism right now. Because as you point out, if you're a big journalistic organization, worldwide like CNN is, or nationwide like the New York Times, those are two different mediums. So I guess if you stick to newspapers, right, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and even the Washington Post to some extent, doing okay in this environment. They're not flourishing, but they're holding on. But so many of these smaller papers, and not even smaller papers, when I worked at the Denver Post, we had a daily competition with the Rocky Mountain News. That was a city that had two major newspapers competing for news, competing to tell you what's going on, and competing for eyeballs. A few years ago, the Rocky Mountain News closed. They folded that newspaper. It was the oldest newspaper in Colorado. It was the first, the biggest and one of the first newspapers in that state. And it folded because the economics weren't there. And to your point, that really hurt the ability of people in Colorado to know what's going on, because a lot of the local corruption, the local shenanigans, the statewide office holders, we've seen a decline in the number of state house reporters. And that's how I came up. I covered 3 different state houses. And the decisions that those lawmakers are making every day really impact people, to sometimes to a much larger extent than even Congress or the presidency. But all of those local office holders aren't being held to account because the economics aren't there anymore. And it's a great question, what happens? I mean, I think you're seeing a scaling down of the local papers. The Denver Post, sadly, just went through yet another buyout process, recently, where they asked more journalists to, take a buyout package so that they could thin that staff and bring their costs down. And that's a problem. I mean, anytime you are losing experienced journalists who know their communities, who know their states, and know where to sniff out corruption or malfeasance, or frankly, or just to tell a good story about, here's something that's happening in your local community that you'll want to hear about. I mean, it doesn't always have to be bad news. It's just people who understand and know their communities and are talented and experienced veterans of storytelling. When you lose those, I think it will hurt democracy. But I am an optimist in as much that I think things are, popping up to try to take its place. In Colorado, for instance, there's a couple of online news organizations that are trying to fill that gap. When it comes to investigative journalism, so much of that has been cut back because the big major dailies, your Chicago Tribunes, your LA Times, your Philadelphia Inquirers, they used to have these huge staffs that would do these great investigative pieces, and in fact do huge, serial pieces. I mean, not many people remember, but Black Hawk Down by Mark Bowden, that book that became the movie, that was first serialized when I was a kid in the Philadelphia Inquirer. I read that in the newspaper day after day, and here was this amazing reporting by a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter on the ground in Mogadishu telling us what happened in a firefight where American helicopters were shot down, right? Like, you don't see that anymore. But there are places trying to replace that, an investigative realm, I think, of ProPublica, which is a nonprofit that partners with newsrooms to do investigative reporting, where they have a staff of all of their own reporters. There's the Center for Investigative Reporting, a similar structure, where you're starting to see a nonprofit model, because the newspaper model, remember, that was a monopoly, right? Like, you had nowhere else to go if you were Macy's and you wanted to advertise your department store sale. If you were a guy trying to sell a car, you went to the classifieds. Like, there wasn't a lot of options about where you could advertise in your local communities outside of the newspaper. That made newspapers hugely profitable. But when the internet came and Craigslist came in, and all these other websites started to pop up where people could spend their advertising dollars, you saw that drop off. reporting is really expensive. I don't think people realize how expensive it is. I mean, that piece that I did, on the meatpacking plant, I mean, I make a nice salary. I was working with a producer who makes a good salary. We had, for that shoot, 2 photojournalists. We had travel out there. I mean, this was something that probably, I don't know what it cost, but tens of thousands of dollars just to do that piece. That's an extraordinary amount of money to bring you those stories. People don't necessarily think about news as something that is an investment. They see it as a disposable commodity. And a lot of that is because so much of the news is the same now. It's kind of these top headlines, top political headlines, because they're trying to grab your eyeballs, that we're starting to lose that undergirding of reporting that drives all that aggregation. I'll get off my soapbox now. I feel like I just went on a whole a whole rant. So I'll get off the soapbox.
That's great. No, that's great.
And you have to finish with saying, "And I'm mad as hell."
And I'm not going to take it anymore.
Getting ready to speak with you, I looked at a lot of the history of the news. I found this quote by Samuel Johnson, who was a 18th century British writer, thinker, moralist, and essayist. And he said about the British press of his time, the press affords sufficient information to elate vanity and stiffen obstinacy, but too little to enlarge the mind. and I think with particularly in election cycles or covering DC, which when you were with the National Journal, you covered the connection between Congress and K Street, and where's the money? Where's the money going? I think that's a lot of what enrages and frustrates the general public about DC. And a question that Ben and I get from our listeners a lot is the media is so biased. Where can I go to get unbiased media? And often our response has been, you need to seek media from multiple sources. Mm-hmm. Well, working in the media and being perceived as being biased, I'm sure everybody in the media is perceived as being biased by someone else. How do you handle that? And do you see bias in the media?
So those are great questions, and I love how you set it up with an old school quote, because I think when after the media was born, the second thing that was born was media criticism, right? And that's just always been the case, and it is kind of just part of the job. You're going to shoot the messenger sometimes, and certainly I think there is media bias, and I think you see it on both sides, and I also think though that the places that I have worked that have striven to live up to a nonpartisan, non-biased, here's what happened, and here are the facts, and maybe another story, here's the analysis that we think it means. I think that is the most important kind of reporting. It's the bedrock of reporting. And look, I've been accused of media bias from everybody, every side, right? Republicans, Democrats. And when I started out in the business, it was people sending me letters about how I'm biased. And then email happened, and then I got it lots more by email. In fact, I was covering the Obamacare debate back in 2009 very, very closely, round the clock. And I wrote a story about, Medicare and how Obamacare might change it. And somebody actually sent me an email that, had some not kind words for my grandmother. I was like, hey, I'm writing about Medicare, but let's leave my grandmother out of this, all right? So, it kind of comes with the territory. And now with social media, it's essentially, somebody can, put something up and criticize you as, while you're on the air still. And, that will kind of start a chain reaction of multiple people chiming in and starting, kind of a flash mob about how you're a shill for the Democrats or, in bed with the Republicans or whatever. And that's just part of the job. And, I look at it as if, on any given day, if I'm upsetting somebody, then, that's okay. And I'm probably doing my job because I'm telling you something you didn't want to hear about your side or your beliefs. And that's kind of my job, because so much of what we get is an echo chamber where we can kind of choose our own media now. And so when you hear something that doesn't jive with how you believe the world works, that can be upsetting to you. And your first reaction might be, well, they're biased and they don't like my guy. If anything, I think the media is biased toward those in power. And, we pay a lot of attention to the president. We pay a lot of attention to, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, and we pay less attention to those people in the minority. And, right now you have, of course, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Lots of attention is going to get paid to them. Lots of, questions because they want to lead our nation. That's appropriate. And I think that if you hear something you don't like, you might say it's biased. But I think if you're a news consumer, I think you guys give great advice. I think you should be looking at all kinds of different media. And if you tend to be Republican, then you probably should watch a little MSNBC, and you should, read the New York Times editorial page. And that's another thing to point out. A lot of times you get painted by your editorial page. An editorial page is wholly independent from the newspaper itself. Those reporters at the New York Times, they are nonpartisan, non-biased folks. Same with the reporters at the Wall Street Journal. Those are two very different editorial pages. One, the Journal is very tends to be more conservative. The New York Times tends to be more liberal. But that because they have an editorial page, people look at the news product and say, well, it must be influenced by those guys on the editorial page. And I can tell you it's not. I mean, they're separate departments. They're almost a church and state separation between them. They're the editorial writers and the head editorial editor. They have nothing to do with the news report. And similarly, I think you see that kind of started to happen on cable news as well. The primetime shows on Fox, tend to be kind of more conservative leaning. The primetime shows on MSNBC tend to be more liberal. And you can argue about how that has flowed through the daytime shows as well, but there are real reporters there. I work with Major Garrett at National Journal, a longtime Fox News reporter, straight reporter, as straight as an arrow. A guy who worked at Fox for many, many years. He also worked at CNN. He's now at CBS News. No matter where Major worked, he was a straight down the line reporter. It didn't matter. And I think that's another thing you can do as a viewer, as a reader. You can find reporters who you think are doing that straight reporting. And it's never been easier because reporters are constantly branding themselves. They're on Twitter, they're on Facebook. They move around from outlet to outlet, but they're still their own brand. Whereas, a generation ago, it mattered more what came after your name. I'm Chris Frates with CNN. That mattered more. Now we're in an era where, if you are your own media brand, then people can find you and they can read you no matter where you are. They can listen to you no matter where you are, and find reporters who you think do a good, fair job and follow them and support their work and buy their product.
Chris, the way that Donald Trump utilizes Twitter and has utilized Twitter in this election cycle, has he rendered the press irrelevant?
No, I don't think so. I think Donald Trump has done many things, and one of them, I think, is really become the first social media candidate. I mean, he understands social media. He understands how it works. And if anything, he was able to almost program the networks using Twitter, because he would say something early in the day on Twitter, and then that would get picked up as news, and then it would be reported as news all day. People would react to that, and that would further the story. So if anything, I don't think he's made it irrelevant. I think he has figured out a way to, in a very savvy way, amplify his message. It wasn't just his Twitter followers who were hearing about what Donald Trump had to say on Twitter, because he would say things that he knew would make news. It wasn't like he was tweeting these, kind of more boring policy statements about, I support, I support immigration reform. No, it was, we're going to build a wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. Well, he understands how to package it in a way that he almost programmed, morning news television from his Twitter account, and we're seeing how that plays out. And that's been a real change in this election cycle that we haven't seen in past election cycles. In each election cycle, we see how social media and technology really start to change how elections work, how people get their information. And this is just another example. I don't think it makes the media irrelevant at all. In fact, it makes our jobs even more important because these candidates have the ability to say whatever they want by completely bypassing the media. So then it becomes our job to, fact check that. Is that true? Is that accurate? Is it a little bit misleading? Well, that's our job, is to say that's just another way for them to communicate. Instead of them holding a press conference where then we write about it, they say some things on Twitter or Facebook or other Instagram, Vines, however they want to get their message out. It's then our job to say, well, yes, that's true, but, or, kind of fact check. And we've done a lot of that in this election from both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
But hasn't the media been kind of not believed by the general public? Like where Trump will say something, the media will fact check it, it'll be debunked, but his followers and supporters it's a rigged system. He's framed the debate that the media is rigged against him and against the public at large. And has he won? Is he beating the media at this game?
Well, look, I mean, this is not a new argument from Donald Trump that the media is rigged. We've seen, he has been very forceful about it. He has used the words rigged instead of biased. We've heard from particularly Republicans and conservatives for more than a generation now that the liberal media is biased against them. And, that goes all the way back, it goes way back. But when we started to see conservatives take action on that was really in the early 80s when we started to see talk radio. Conservative talk radio was a reaction to the idea among conservatives that liberal bias was keeping them from getting their message out. And they started to counter-program, the liberal media with conservative talk radio. Rush Limbaugh among, kind of one of the innovators of that medium. And so this is not a new argument from Donald Trump. It's one we've seen over and over again. And as the internet has grown, we have seen, lots of different points of view and sites that have grown up. I'm thinking about Red State by Eric Erickson, but we also have, Josh Marshall with Talking Points Memo on the more liberal side. So, I mean, this idea, this balkanization of, some media, I think you have your mainstream media, which tries to remain, objective and non-biased. And then you have kind of an explosion of partisan media, which really just brings us back to kind of the beginning of media. The pamphleteers and Thomas Locke, they all had points of view. And if you look at how newspapers started, you have still in existence the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. Well, that was a Democratic paper, and it was founded that way. It ended up becoming part of the mainstream media, and it kind of lost its, partisan heritage, as the newspapers consolidated and monopolized. But that's not a new thing in American history to have, kind of partisan media. But the idea that conservatives have felt like the liberal media didn't hear them, that they weren't listened to, that's not new. And I think, the other piece of that's interesting to look at is when you look at kind of where media comes from, it comes from largely New York and Washington. And the worldview and the life experience of people living in some of the biggest cities in the country is different than the life experience of people who live out in the rest of America. And having lived out and worked out in, what the kind of the elites on the coast like to call the flyover countries, it's a different way of life. And I think that's a frustration too, is that that's not reflected in the coverage as much either. And that's something I think we could always do a better job at, which is trying to cover the country as a whole, as opposed to kind of just the power centers of Wall Street, Washington, Hollywood. And I think that's a critique that is that's valid.
Ben?
Yeah, I think that's I think it's a very interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about the importance of talk radio in the rise of the conservative movement. And it's interesting because I think a lot of times we tend to think about how new technologies disrupt and change dialogue. But sometimes in this case, it's a clear point where it's an older technology that just happens to be an outlet that is very good for the conservatives in America. And that's an interesting perspective.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and it's one that I think that's why whenever there's these, the internet's going to destroy newspapers. You have to kind of look back over history, and that was said about newspapers when the advent of radio, took hold of America's imagination, and then television was going to kill radio, and the internet was going to kill television, and instead you see that these mediums lose some of their power. They're not as influential because there's not as many people watching them because there's more places to go for your news and entertainment. But they change and they morph, and they still remain an important storytelling tool. I don't think we'll lose any of those things. I think they'll just change.
Which takes us back to the beginning of our conversation. Chris, can you just one more time plug your shows? Where can people hear you and see you?
I appreciate that, Bob. It's Politics Inside Out. Me and Mark Preston co-host it every week on Sirius XM's POTUS Channel 124. You can catch it 3 times. You can get it Saturday at 9 a.m. fresh off the mics. Then it will replay at Sunday noon, Monday at 2 o'clock. And you can listen to it anytime, of course, on the Sirius XM app. And you can also find me on CNN.com and on CNN. I'm an investigative correspondent for the cable news network.
I got to say, being on the show with you and Mark, you guys made me cry. So, but it's easy to make me cry. I'm like Dick Vermeil meets John Boehner. So it's not that difficult to make me cry, but those guys do a great show, great interviews.
I like the fact that Bob is going back for a few more mom points at the end of the episode here.
He gets it. He knows his demo, and he's just going to milk it for all it's worth. And to your listeners, I think if you go on to the Sirius app and check out Politics Inside Out, I think that episode, Bob, where you and I and Mark talked, is still on demand. So if folks want to listen to it, they want to hear your story instead of hearing me talk so much, hear you tell your story, I would encourage them to check it out because it was one of our favorite interviews that we've done.
Hey, and I am a big fan of POTUS, so please tell Julie Mason and Michael Smirkanis and Mark and everybody that I said hello.
I will do it. And guys, thank you so much for having me on. This was a blast.
It was our pleasure.
Thanks for being here,
Chris.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Road to Now. For more on our podcast, you can check us out at www.theroadtonow.com. You can follow us on Twitter at road_to_now and check out our Facebook page as well. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we'd really appreciate it if you take the time to spread the word to your friends and take the time to rate us on iTunes or whatever apparatus you use to get your podcasts. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Have a great day.